Why should you read classical poetry? Because let me tell you guys, it's really hard. The word that comes to mind right now is drudgery. Because, of course, modern free verse poetry is much more fun to read. And I would say it's better. So, why would we need to read the classics? Well, today you don't need to hear from me. Instead, we are going to hear from the legendary female poet Mary Oliver on why we should be engaging not just with classical poetry, but trying our hand at writing it. And I've been a high school teacher for the past 7 years. And when it's that time of the year when we have to read classical poetry, I hear the groans and the moans. And for the first week, it's like I'm carrying everybody, 200 students, on my back. But then something clicks. Something foundational exists within classical poetry. That's important for us to discover. And if you don't already know, my name is Ian, and on this channel, we cover the greatest books and authors of all time. And even more important than that, I help authors like you write consciously so your work can change the world. And a lot of those greatest authors and books are in the Western canon. They are the classics. So, enough from me. Let us now hear from Mary Oliver. Quote, acquaintance with the main body of English poetry is absolutely essential. It is clearly the whole cake. While what has been written in the last 100 years or so, without meter, is no more than an icing. And indeed, I do not really mean an acquaintanceship. I mean an engrossed and able affinity with metrical verse. To be without this felt sensitivity to a poem as a structure of lines and rhythmic energy and repetitive sound is to be forever less equipped, less deft than the poet who dreams of making a new thing can afford to be. Free verse, after all, developed from metrical verse, and they are not so very different. One is strictly patterned, one is not, but both employ choice of line length, occasional enjambment, heavy and light stresses, etc. And Oliver is absolutely correct here because, of course, I'm not asking you to write in an iambic pentameter. Maybe that would be good. But outside of the strict forms of poetry that we find in classic authors, metaphor, contrast, line length, these things that are important if you're trying to take your own poetry seriously or just be a good reader of poetry have existed for thousands of years. And what's interesting about our modern era of poetry is that look what you're doing right now. You are on YouTube wasting time. Shakespeare, John Donne, even someone like Sylvia Plath, they did not have the immense amount of distractions that we have. And so if they had the bug, the virus of wanting to be a writer, they had a much easier time sitting down at the desk and making that happen. And I'm saying this because we have a lot to learn from them because most people who call themselves poets now, who are getting published, who have MFAs or are teaching poetry workshops, in terms of how much time they've put in compared to some of the classic poets or authors from that era, they are behind tens of thousands of hours and are probably never going to catch up. And it's a very odd thing because it almost hurts our egos as modern authors to admit this because when you look at other fields, for instance, sports, every single year the athletes are getting better. When we look at technology or coding or the medical industry, almost any industry, there is a massive amount of progression. But our job is to sit alone at a desk without distractions for tens of thousands of hours. And we have to read and read deeply. And that's what Oliver is talking about here, which I 100% support. She says that modern poetry is just the icing on the cake because I think us English speakers, us people in the Western world, I know some of you guys are global right now, but we assume that classical poetry means all the dead white men in Europe. And it obviously means that. But personally, all my favorite classical poets are not white. My favorite poets are from 8th century China in the Tang Dynasty. I'm sure that's not how you say it. Guys like Li Po, Tu Fu, Cold Mountain, Wang Wei, they touch my heart. That's who I want to be when I am older. Oh, wait, I'm already kind of old. And when I look at their work and compare it to my students, to the people I went to school with in graduate school, and all the authors I know online, these dudes in the year 716 are better poets than most people I know today. Most likely. I mean, they're better poets than me and most likely a better poet than you. And they are not writing about Christ or all these things that we think classical poetry needs to be. And it continues. We have Rumi in in 13th century Afghanistan or Turkey, that area, writing beautiful poetry. Rumi is a master. We have Kabir over in India in the 16th century. We have Ikkyu in Japan in the 15th century writing some fire. And so when you start wanting to approach this stuff, I just want to let you guys know that it's an expansive world with people who are totally disconnected from the Western world and are talking about things that are fun. Ikkyu was a Zen monk in Japan who was very talented at being a monk, but he broke from the monastic teachings and strictness of Zen Buddhism and was, sleeping with prostitutes and talking about wine, but he was also a very enlightened individual and a damn good poet. Same thing with Rumi. The Chinese poets I was talking about were Taoists. And I guess the one thing they don't have that I think Oliver would say is important, and I would say is important also, is that obviously they were not writing in the English language, and you and I are writing in the English language. And so there is something lost in translation. If you speak another language, you understand that when you read something in its original translation, most of the time, even if they have a very great translator, it loses a lot on its way over here to English. Same thing going with English to other languages. But the world of poetry in England isn't as bleak as you may think. Because, yes, when we get to the Victorian with John Browning or like earlier, John Donne and like all those guys, and it's like, it fucking sucks. It's like these aristocratic weird guys and they're writing these weird narrative poetry things. And that's important too, man. I took this class on Browning. And at the end of the semester, we had a 25-page paper due on just one of his poems. We had a close read for 25 pages, one of the poems. And let me tell you, that was terrible. I was like, I contemplated withdrawing or like just taking the F for the class. But immersing myself in it and like engaging with the secondary literature and spending probably 100 hours writing that essay really did expand my mind on a certain aspect of poetry I would never get before. But let's not talk about them because they suck. That's like wasting time talking about Drake when we're talking about great rappers, even from the past, or talking about Chameleonaire or whatever rapper was big in the 2000s. Anyway, poetry isn't necessarily dead, but it's going to require a little bit of effort in the sense that some of my favorite poems come from an era that wasn't as inundated with Christianity, because poetry at its greatest form is actually an imitation of nature, is a representation of our animistic relationship with reality. And what do I mean by that? Animism is the attribution of a soul to animals, plants, and inanimate objects. And all pagan cultures, most of the time, not 99% of the time, are animistic. But Christianity is inherently non-animistic. The only animistic part of Christianity is, I guess, a relationship with a mostly silent God. But many pagan cultures had a deep connection with nature, obviously, and were engaging in being inspired by the coyotes and the spirit of coyotes, or rocks and ravens, like all these different types of things. And this actually translated to language. And a lot of poets in pagan cultures, and this is something that would happen all across the world, would write poetry that mirrored the energy of certain plants. The form of their work would be the forms of nature. I'm not talking about they'd write like a poem that looked like a tree, but they would feel. Yes, I'm talking about to people, in the technology era that don't really feel into the energy of, these archetypal things. And then they would write poetry from that, which is super progressive. And so, for instance, one of the great and first English poems or stories, Beowulf, follows this form. But a lot of the Arthurian romances and Arthurian poetry and a lot of that stuff was close enough to kind of a pagan period in England because, of the colonization of England near the turn of the millennia, that they, have this authenticity. They connect with love and these deeper things. And one could also say that Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales connects with this also. And one of the greatest pleasures I've ever had, and Chaucer is a poet, even though he's a long form poetry, is reading Chaucer. He's an absolute master. And obviously you have to understand Middle English to be able to get through his works. But by the time we hit Shakespeare, it's almost been that kind of original energy has been disintegrated. And Shakespeare moves into this idea, really helps us capture self consciousness for the first time in the English language. I mean, it had been happening, but that's why he's so inspirational to this day, is that he really was in his own mind and in his character's mind and working with deep plots and characterization and these types of things. But that is of the human world. And so they're doing forms and the meters that are very connected and connected to the aristocracy and royalty, and it's somewhat competitive, and that's okay. But I also want to let you guys know before we get further into classical poetry that there's another avenue too that you could start with. I would highly recommend you don't start with John Milton, but rather Beowulf or Chaucer or the Arthurian romances, or even better, some of the kind of more international classical poets I just mentioned. And hopefully that will show you like, okay, these people aren't messing around. These people weren't idiots. Maybe they believed the earth was flat or whatever, but we believe things that aren't true that, will be disproved hundreds of years from now, and they'll be like, what the hell were they thinking? And I'm recommending this path because Oliver tells us you don't need to, I don't want you to have an acquaintanceship. I want you to be engrossed. I want you to have an affinity with this type of verse because everything sprouts up from this. Because when we look at the modernists and the big break, the big push into free verse at the start of the 20th century, all their idols, everyone they were imitating were classical poets. And modernism is still probably the most influential movement, at least in American poetry, maybe outside of like E-Girl, Rupi Kaur, emotionality. I'm just trauma dumping on the page. That's the most popular form of poetry right now. But serious poetry is very much in reverence to modernism, and the modernists were huge fans. And, to be able to break like that, to be able to move away from classical poetry like they did, it was a big deal. And they were engrossed and had a deep affinity with those people. And so that's why when you read modern poetry, a lot of the time, once again, they smoke poets of today because they had that formal training. But we have an advantage because we have 124 years now of free verse that we can look at. And then we have 1,300 good years of poetry that's classical that we can study too. And then we can combine those together eventually. And I think that we can, stand on the shoulders of our predecessors and produce much better stuff. Because too much free verse eventually becomes too much navel gazing, and you get kind of the poetry we are doing now that doesn't have a soul, that doesn't feel conscious, that isn't aesthetically great. It lacks a lot of these things that were of the utmost importance. If you were going to be the next big and famous poet, you had to do something like Paradise Lost or Dante's Inferno. You had to be as good as Shakespeare or some of these other figures. Like the bar was set really high, but the bar today in poetry is set pretty low because of many different reasons. And so I'm calling upon you guys right now. Let us start to read classical poetry. I'm going to have more videos on how to get into classical poetry, how to read it. I have a ton of videos on writing poetry and about other poets. And so I will start a playlist down below on classical poetry. So if you are interested in more, you can subscribe and you will start to see more videos, hopefully, on poetry dropping very soon. Peace.